Hey friends, before we wrap ourselves in blankets and settle into our comfort tonight, imagine a world where warmth is a privilege and winter is a predator. Tonight, we journey back, not to castles and kings, but to the smoke-filled huts of medieval peasants, the forgotten people, the ones who fought the cold not with swords, but with silence, fire, and resilience. This is not a tale of royalty. It's a story of survival, of mothers clutching their children through sleepless nights, of frostbitten mornings and quiet courage, of how the poorest endured the cruelest season and lived to see another spring. The sky hung low, iron gray and silent. Snow had long buried the roads, the fields, the outlines of the living world. For a peasant in 14th century Europe, winter was not a season, it was a threat. It came not with glittering snowflakes and quiet mornings, but with hunger, sickness, and the quiet horror of cold that crept into bones and did not leave. Imagine it, a one-room cottage, its walls made of wattle and daub, sticks crisscrossed and packed with mud, straw, dung. No insulation, no chimney. The wind seeps through the smallest seams, slipping under doors, whispering through the rafters. It carries death in its breath. There is no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters, kept closed at night and barred against the snow. During the day, they are opened only for moments, long enough to see if the world still exists, if the paths are buried, if the neighbor's roof has collapsed. Every opening costs warmth. Inside, a central hearth burns low. There is no grate, just stone, perhaps iron if the family is lucky. Firewood is scarce, must be rationed. Peasants gather twigs, dung cakes, bits of peat, anything that will burn. Logs are reserved for the wealthier manners. A peasant's fire smokes thick and low, filling the house with bitter fumes. The smell clings to hair and skin, but smoke is life. It keeps insects and rodents at bay. It dries damp walls. It marks the difference between a home and a tomb. At night, the fire must not die. Letting it burn too brightly is wasteful. Fuel is precious. But if it goes out, it is not easily relit. Peasants bank the fire, rake hot coals into a pile and cover them with ash to keep them alive until morning. A single glowing ember becomes the guardian of the household. Every few hours, someone rises from bed, shivering to stir it back into life. The bedding is rough. Straw or hay lies directly on the floor. Fleas are inevitable. Lice, a fact of life. If the family is fortunate, they sleep on a wooden frame, the mattress stuffed with rushes or rags. A woolen blanket, if they own one, is laid on top. Otherwise, it is cloaks, furs, or whatever can be layered. Children often sleep with animals, not just for companionship, but for warmth. A pig, a dog, a chicken, any creature with body heat is welcome under the same roof. Peasants sleep in their clothes, all of them. Linen undergarments, woolen tunics, leather belts, and boots. Everything is kept on at night, even hats and hoods. They are not changed for weeks. Layers of grease and sweat become natural barriers against the cold. Filth becomes armor. The family huddles together. Husband, wife, children, sometimes a grandparent or two. There is no privacy, but privacy is not a concern. Proximity is warmth. The closer the bodies, the better the chance of surviving until morning. Above them, the roof groans. Thatched straw soaked with snow begins to sag. Leaks are patched with cloth, dung, moss. The weight of ice causes collapses every winter. When it happens, the family may not survive. Food is simple. A pot of gruel hangs above the fire. Oats, if possible, thickened with root vegetables, herbs, perhaps a scrap of meat. Garlic is used for warmth, as well as for protection from spirits. Peasants believe cold is more than a force of nature. It is a punishment, a darkness sent by God or devils. They pray, not for comfort, but for survival. Crosses are carved into wooden beams, charms are hung in corners. In some regions, villagers burn herbs to drive away winter spirits. Water is rarely drunk cold in winter. It is boiled or used in broth. Snow can be melted, but it is time-consuming. Wine, if available, is watered down and warmed by the hearth. Ale is preferred. It is hearty, nourishing, and less likely to freeze. Illness waits in the corners. Colds deepen into fevers. Frostbite is common. Fingers and toes blacken. Chilblains erupt. There are no doctors here. Only wise women, herbalists, and prayers. Elderberry, garlic, sage, anything that can be foraged or preserved may be steeped in broth and given to the sick. Sometimes it helps, often it doesn't. But the villagers are not helpless. They are resilient. The cold does not surprise them. They have prepared all year. In spring, herbs were dried and salted. In summer, grain was harvested. In autumn, pigs were slaughtered. Sausages hung from rafters. Onions braided and stored. Beans sealed in jars. Even the poorest families find ways to preserve life. Cabbages buried in sand, potatoes in cellars, meat in salt. Clothing is repaired constantly. A woolen tunic may be patched for decades. Children wear hand-me-downs sewn from scraps. Gloves are rare. Hands are wrapped in cloth, old socks turned into mittens. Shoes are stuffed with straw. Each day begins in darkness. The sun rises late and weak. Light flickers through the smoke and soot-stained air. There are no lamps, only tallow candles dipped from animal fat. They smell terrible, but they burn. Oil lamps are rare treasures. Firelight rules the winter. Children work alongside parents. There are animals to feed, paths to clear, water to haul. Ice must be broken. Snow must be shoveled. Every chore is harder in winter, every movement slower. But the day must be endured, and so it is. By nightfall, the family returns inside. Doors are barred, shutters closed. The fire is fed again. They eat. They pray. They speak little. Stories are told sometimes, softly, with reverence. Tales of saints, of old kings, of distant warmth. And then they sleep, if they can, under blankets that never quite banish the cold. This is the medieval winter. No fantasy, no romance. Only survival. A slow, grinding battle fought not with swords, but with patience, grit, and the fragile glow of firelight. And always, just beyond the door, the cold waits, watching, listening. But even the cold cannot conquer those who endure it with silence and fire. And so, the peasants live, not comfortably, not safely, but stubbornly, through season after season, one frozen night at a time. There's something unnatural about silence in winter. Not peace, but absence. The birds have vanished. The rivers have stopped speaking. Even the trees seem to hold their breath beneath layers of hoarfrost. In this kind of stillness, time bends. Days blend together, each one a struggle toward spring. But to survive the season, the medieval peasant had to do more than just wait. Survival required intention, strategy, and above all, community. While the nobleman might retreat behind stone walls and storehouses, the peasant family relied on bonds that stretched beyond blood. Winters were not survived alone. They were endured in clusters, neighbors, kin, widows, orphans, sometimes strangers sharing one roof. It wasn't uncommon for 2 or 3 families to share a single cottage through the deepest months, pressed together for warmth and mutual aid. The hearth was their center. More than heat, it was a place of memory, superstition, ritual. Fire wasn't simply functional, it was sacred. It had to be fed properly, banked respectfully, never insulted. Children were taught early to treat flame as a living thing. To mistreat the fire was to invite misfortune into the home. Above the fire hung the cooking pot, often the only cooking vessel a family owned. It never left its hook. Meals were layered through the day. In the morning, perhaps barley or leftover pottage. By evening, new additions of turnip, beans, dried herbs, and sometimes a bone or rind for flavor. This method created an evolving stew, a perpetual broth, known in some regions as perpetual soup. It nourished as long as it was tended. Food preservation had been the obsession of autumn. Root vegetables stored in pits lined with straw and dung. Grains kept in sealed barrels, apples strung up on rafters, cured meat tied in bundles above the hearth to avoid rats. These efforts were not luxuries. They were lines drawn between life and death. Still, hunger was constant. Winter reduced the human appetite to its barest needs. Bread, if it existed, was often coarse and dark, made from rye or barley. Sometimes even sawdust was added to stretch the flour. Mold was scraped off. Stale pieces were softened with broth. Nothing was wasted. Children worked quietly. They fetched water from half-frozen wells, gathered dung for fuel, stitched holes in clothing. Idleness was dangerous. It bred despair. And in the dark weeks of winter, despair could creep in like smoke through the rafters. To counter it, peasants turned to rhythm and ritual. The rhythm of the day: wake before light, feed the fire, break the ice from water buckets, care for animals. The rhythm of chores: spinning wool, mending tools, weaving baskets. Even in deepest cold, hands were kept moving. And then there were the rituals, ways to guard the fragile boundary between man and winter. At the solstice, some villages lit symbolic fires in the fields, offerings to the sun's return. Others carved protective runes into doorposts or sprinkled salt on thresholds. In certain regions, dried herbs and twigs were bound together and burned. Not for warmth, but to ward off spirits believed to lurk in the frozen dark. Stories, too, were weapons against the cold. After nightfall, once bellies were modestly filled and the fire revived, elders would speak in low voices. Tales of saints who walked barefoot across snow, of beasts who spoke on midwinter nights, of men who froze not because the cold killed them, but because they gave up. One such tale warned of the blue sleep, a creeping drowsiness that came to those exposed too long. Victims would lie down in snow, smiling, believing themselves warm. It was a death so gentle it was feared most of all. And so the peasants watched one another. If someone stayed out too long, others called them back. If a neighbor's hearth went dark, someone checked in. The dead of winter demanded not just endurance, but vigilance. The body itself became a battlefield. People learned to trap heat, to dress not for fashion or even comfort, but for survival. Linen closest to the skin, wool over that, fur if they had it. Nothing was ever worn loose. Cold air must be denied entry. Feet were especially vulnerable. Boots were rare. Most peasants wrapped their feet in cloth and stuffed them with straw. A child's shoes might be made from stitched rags, their soles reinforced with scrap leather. Wetness was an enemy. Feet that remained damp too long invited rot, and so footwear was dried by the fire each night, no matter how small the flames. As for hygiene, it changed. Bathing in winter was rare and dangerous. Cold water could shock the system. Instead, people wiped with cloth, rubbed with ashes, or simply endured the grime. Scented herbs were burned to mask odor. Soap was a luxury. Cleanliness gave way to survival. The animals shared the same space. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs slept beside children, goats pressed themselves into dark corners. Their breath warmed the air. Their bodies were insulation. Their presence meant life. And yet the home was not a place of serenity. It was crowded, smoky, pungent with sweat and dung and old food. Ventilation meant heat loss, so the smoke lingered, clung to skin and thatch, blackened beams. Children developed coughs, eyes watered constantly. But still, the fire remained the center of everything. When possible, villagers ventured to the church. The stone walls offered no more warmth than their cottages. But they offered structure, prayers, songs, the rhythm of liturgy. Faith didn't make the cold go away, but it gave it meaning. Suffering became part of a divine order. Pain was a passage, spring a promise. And so the days passed. Ice thickened on walls, snow layered like sediment over thatched roofs. Wolves were heard in the distance. Grain stores grew lighter. Yet inside the cottage, life continued. Cramped, smoky, cold, but defiant. Evenings were the worst. After chores ended and light failed, time stretched. Some embroidered, others whittled. Many simply sat and stared into the flames, thoughts slow as frost. There was little laughter, but there was music, simple melodies hummed under breath, rhythms beaten softly on tabletops, a lullaby for the fire. Children were told to dream of summer, of green fields, sun on the river, apples swelling on trees. But winter dreams were strange. They blurred with memories. They twisted with fears. Sometimes people dreamed of warmth so vivid they believed they had already died. But dawn always came, even if hidden behind clouds. And with it, the work resumed. The endless work of survival. There's a point in every long winter when the body begins to forget warmth. Not just the warmth of fire, but of sun on skin, of earth underfoot. Cold becomes the constant. Everything else, heat, comfort, ease, becomes a memory, fading like breath on glass. By the heart of January, the peasants' fight became less about resisting the weather and more about preserving the mind. Time no longer moved forward. It circled. One freezing day became the mirror of the next. Hunger narrowed thought. Fatigue dulled senses. Despair crept in silently, like frost on windowless walls. Mental endurance was as vital as physical strength. Families developed ways to mark time, to resist the endless sameness. Not through calendars, they were rare, but through routine, by rituals as simple as sharpening tools, mending broken baskets, weaving one more foot of thread. Small accomplishments reminded people they were still alive, still capable. Elders became invaluable, not just for their wisdom, but for their steadiness. They remembered harsher winters, leaner years. Their stories weren't distractions. They were anchors. They helped younger generations frame their suffering, to know it had been survived before and could be again. Children, too, were protectors of morale. Their play, limited though it was, offered moments of laughter, a game with bundled rags, a song invented on the spot. Laughter in the cold wasn't just relief. It was resistance. Outside, the landscape transformed into something both beautiful and deadly. Snow-blanketed fields with deceptive serenity. Icicles adorned eaves like frozen spears. The forest, once a place of gathering and work, now held menace. Wolves, driven closer to settlements by hunger, were no longer just stories. Some winters were marked by wolf attacks, not just on livestock, but on people. Children gone missing in the woods, night travelers vanishing. In some villages, doors were barred at sunset, not just against the cold, but against the wild. Fires were left burning at thresholds. Bells hung from trees. In parts of Eastern Europe, entire legends developed around wolf spirits, creatures believed to punish those who disrespected nature. But nature's fury wasn't always dramatic. Often it was quiet. A leaking roof that allowed snow melt to rot the thatch. A collapsed grain bin. A burst container of salted meat. In those cases, the loss was not just material. It could push a family over the edge into starvation. Famine wasn't always declared. It crept in, first as tightened rations, then skipped meals, then decisions: feed the children, not the elders. Eat the seed grain, knowing spring planting would fail. Boil bark into broth, scrape lichen from stones. Sometimes, food was stolen. In many villages, theft in winter was understood, if not forgiven. But when hunger hit everyone equally, even small crimes could divide a community. Accusations flew. Trust fractured. There were winters where murder occurred not for revenge or jealousy, but for bread. These dark realities birthed taboos. Unspoken codes of winter behavior. Do not hoard openly. Do not gloat about having food. Do not ignore a starving child. Peasants knew that winter's grip could last longer than expected, and those who helped others might themselves be helped in return. Still, some died, quietly. A grandmother in her sleep, a child who simply didn't wake, a man who went to chop wood and didn't return. Death in winter was not marked by ceremony. Graves could not be dug in frozen ground. Bodies were wrapped in cloth and stored in outbuildings or under snow until thaw. In the village church, prayers became desperate. Saints were called by name: Saint Brigid for warmth, Saint Cuthbert for protection from wind, Saint Sebastian to ward off illness. Each candle burned in hope, each coin given from poverty. Faith didn't cure the cold, but it gave shape to fear. Some communities practiced strange customs to call back the sun. In northern regions, effigies of winter were built from straw and wood, figures with hollow eyes and skeletal arms. They were dragged through the village and burned as a plea for the season to release its grip. These rituals, half Christian, half pagan, were not entertainment. They were survival theater. Inside, innovations made all the difference. Some cottages used wall hangings, not decorative, but insulating. Old cloaks or straw mats nailed over cold stone to hold in heat. Windows, if they existed, were covered with horn, waxed cloth, or thin leather, letting in light but keeping out wind. Sleeping arrangements shifted. Beds were pushed closer together. Children slept in pairs or groups, often with animals. The sick were placed closest to the hearth, though that heat was modest. Blankets were rare, often shared. Most slept fully clothed, sometimes with gloves and caps. In some villages, hot stones were placed in cloth and tucked under bedding. In wealthier households, brass warming pans filled with embers served the same purpose. But for most, it was the body that warmed the bed, not the other way around. Peasants rarely slept through the night. Second sleep was common. People would sleep a few hours after dusk, wake around midnight to tend the fire, pray, talk, or perform quiet chores, then return to bed until dawn. This segmented sleep matched the rhythm of the season: brief light, long dark. The idea of night as a single, silent stretch was foreign to them. Night was active, uneasy, full of creaks, snores, dreams, whispers. Sometimes it brought omens. Strange noises on the roof, cracked beams, or frost patterns on the wall interpreted as signs. Every detail mattered. Superstition filled the gaps left by knowledge. Weather lore guided daily decisions. A ring around the moon meant snow. A red sunrise warned of wind. Birds flying low signaled a storm. Though not always accurate, these signs gave people a sense of control, a way to read the invisible forces shaping their fate. By February, some change could be felt. A few extra moments of light, icicles beginning to drip. But hope was dangerous. March often betrayed them. A sudden thaw followed by brutal cold. Lambing season meant life, but also death, as fragile animals struggled to survive. It was a cruel threshold, a season between seasons, where every gain could be undone overnight. And yet, peasants prepared for it all. They had no choice. Their lives were bound to a cycle older than memory. Autumn had warned, winter had tested. Now spring waited, but not with open arms. It demanded proof of worth. And so, with frostbitten fingers and hollow bellies, the medieval peasant endured one more night, and then another. Because the secret to surviving winter wasn't strength, it was patience, and the quiet, stubborn hope that soon the world would remember warmth again. By the fourth month of cold, the boundaries between survival and sacrifice blurred. There came a time when strength alone could no longer sustain a household. What endured wasn't just flesh or fire, it was decisions. Choices made in the dark when desperation outweighed decency. And the only moral compass left was the one dulled by starvation. In many rural villages, winter was the season of silence. Not just the quiet of snow, but of secrets. Hidden rations, unspoken debts, silent prayers for one's neighbor to fail so that their hoarded grain might fall to the desperate. Hunger didn't always sharpen virtue. Sometimes it exposed the thin layer of civility barely masking instinct. Still, there were codes, unwritten rules etched into generational memory. A child could be fed before a guest. A neighbor's fire could be borrowed, but only with consent. No one approached another's cottage without calling first. In winter, every act of intrusion could be mistaken for theft, every footstep in the snow a question of intention. Some families sealed themselves off entirely. Doors barred not only against wolves or wind, but against their own community. Fear made people withdraw, and isolation only deepened their vulnerability. Disease found its season in this stillness. The cold didn't kill directly, but it offered the perfect climate for infection. Peasants huddled close for warmth, breathing stale air thick with smoke and sickness. Coughs echoed in the dark like omens. Fevers that would be mild in summer turned deadly when bodies were weakened by frost and famine. Lack of sanitation, already dire, grew worse. Chamber pots spilled, wells froze over, waste sometimes dumped in snow banks that, come thaw, would contaminate entire village paths. Outbreaks of dysentery, respiratory illness, and even pneumonia were common, though few knew their names. They simply said the illness came with the cold and took the frail. Healers, if present, relied on what little knowledge had survived the centuries. Garlic steeped in wine, onion poultices, heated stones wrapped in cloth. Some turned to charms or relics. Pieces of saints' bones, crosses etched on the hearthstone, protective runes scrawled on door frames. Faith was medicinal, because it was the only thing left to offer. In noble households, the experience of winter was different. Stone halls retained heat better than thatch, and multiple hearths kept interiors above freezing. Servants fetched water and wood. Livestock were kept in enclosed barns, and stored food, while still finite, was better preserved. Yet even among the elite, winter was feared. Hunting was dangerous, and roads impassable. Nobles might starve more slowly, but they still starved. Peasants knew this. They watched the manors closely, not out of envy, but caution. Some lords were generous, distributing grain or ordering communal hunts. Others became tyrannical, raising taxes during the leanest months, hoarding stores, or punishing theft with brutal force. Winter either revealed compassion or magnified cruelty. Tithes to the church did not stop. Even in famine, peasants were expected to give a portion of what they grew or stored to God. The priest became an ambiguous figure, both spiritual guide and tax collector. He might offer absolution, but he also recorded who had paid and who had not. The lines between salvation and obligation blurred in the dark of the year. Yet the church was also the keeper of hope. Candlemas in early February marked the beginning of light's return. The blessing of candles was not just symbolic. It was a promise that fire, once a fleeting luxury, would soon become abundant. At the altar, people prayed less for heaven than for spring. Those too weak to wait sometimes wandered. There are records, fragmented, rare, of villagers disappearing into forests, mad with hunger, seeking visions, salvation, or simply escape. Some were later found frozen beneath trees, faces calm, eyes open. It was said the cold tricked them, gave them the illusion of warmth before the end. Others turned to crime. Highway robbery was rare in the deep of winter, but not impossible. More often, theft occurred within the village. Chickens stolen, root cellars raided, tools quietly taken and sold for scraps. Shame followed the act, but not always guilt. Hunger was persuasive. Still, it was not all darkness. In some communities, winter bred solidarity. Communal baking days, when multiple families used a shared oven to conserve wood, became moments of bonding. Song and story circled as much as bread. Even grief was shared. A widow would find her firewood restocked overnight. A sick child might wake to a warm broth left at the door. Humanity persisted, flickering like flame. Not always bright, but enough. In this season, time itself grew strange. Days were not counted by dates, but by signs. A thawing brook, the first crow's call, a patch of earth, black and wet beneath retreating snow. These moments carried the weight of prophecy. Each sign interpreted, sometimes desperately, as evidence that the worst was ending. Peasants observed animals with superstition and care. Cattle growing restless meant temperature change. Birds returning meant longer days. Even insects, seen crawling from walls, signaled the earth stirring. Survival required attention to detail. Observation wasn't just curiosity, it was a tool. Old songs described a figure called the Frost Widow, a ghostly presence said to walk the forests in midwinter, taking warmth from the mouths of sleeping men. Some said she visited cottages with dying embers. Others that she only came when invited, through despair or silence. Stories like hers were told by firelight, to children half asleep, not as warnings, but as explanations for the inexplicable. Not every winter took lives. Some passed gently. But even in their mercy, they carved themselves into memory. Peasants measured their lives not by years, but by winters survived. By the end of February, the rhythm shifted again. Seeds, though scarce, were taken from their hiding places and tested in hand. Tools were sharpened, repairs made to fences and plows. Hope, still cautious, returned. But the land was not ready. The thaw revealed everything hidden: dead livestock, collapsed buildings, waste, rot. The stench of winter's underside. And yet, it was a beginning. Those who had survived bore the season in their posture. They walked slower, looked longer, learned who among them could be trusted and who could not. Children who survived their first true winter were treated differently, not with praise, but with inclusion. They now understood something ineffable, a truth that could not be taught, only endured. And somewhere in the distance, the first snowdrop bloomed through a crack in the ice. Not a symbol, not a miracle, just a sign that the long dark had passed. With the final frost behind them, the peasants' world did not erupt into celebration. Spring, for those who had endured, was not a moment. It was a slow thawing of muscle, mind, and memory. Survival did not come with applause. It came with aching limbs, emptied stores, and broken tools. But still it came. The first true sign was not warmth, but sound. Water, trickling down rooftops, running through ditches, splashing over stones. The winter's silence, once so complete it felt eternal, was breached by movement. The world began to stir. Snow withdrew reluctantly, revealing the scars of months in hiding. Fields were ruined, once flat pastures now pocked and sunken. Livestock bones littered edges of barns. Rotten thatch had caved in roofs, and fences leaned like drunks against the softening ground. Nothing looked as it had. Even the people seemed altered. Faces thinner, beards longer, eyes cautious. The survivors stepped into the light not with triumph, but with suspicion, as if afraid spring might be a trick of the earth, a mirage. Yet even as nature staggered back to life, the rhythms of duty returned. Land needed turning. Fences needed binding. Tools repaired. Oxen coaxed from barns, limbs stiff from months of enclosure. Life demanded movement. No time was given to mourn. Those who had died were remembered not with monuments, but in the labor left behind. A childless mother took in her sister's brood. A widower stood in a field once tilled by two. Their absence echoed in every task, doubled in every silence, where once there was laughter or complaint. In churches, prayers of survival were whispered beneath breath. Thankfulness was real, but restrained. For every life preserved, another had been taken. The cost of endurance was guilt. The price of food had been a neighbor's hunger. The cost of firewood, another's cold. Still, planting began. Scarce seed scattered into cracked earth. Even the poorest cottager held something back, a few peas, a withered grain, a hope. Nothing was wasted. Every kernel placed like a gamble. Each row a silent question posed to the sky. Will you feed us again? Children who had nearly starved were fed sparingly. Too much, too fast, could kill. Gut sickness came easy after famine. Mothers watched closely, hands on bellies, listening to the rhythm of breath and sleep. It took weeks before hunger was no longer the ruling god. Markets reopened, but trade was sluggish. Coin had grown rare over winter, and goods even rarer. The church, however, never faltered. Collections resumed, records updated, dues remembered. By late March, herbs began to grow again. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel. These were the first greens, gathered eagerly, not for feast but medicine. They purged what the cold had left behind. Spring meant healing, but only for those strong enough to recover. Animals bred again. Goats birthed kids. Hens resumed laying. Cows began to fatten. The cycle resumed, not because people willed it, but because nature did. And peasants, ever observant, adapted to the rhythm, not as masters, but as witnesses. Social bonds, tested by the cold, were reforged. Gifts passed between cottages, an egg here, a cup of flour there. Apologies unspoken, but implied. A return to shared labor. The grudges of winter faded, but never disappeared. People remembered who had shared and who had turned their backs. Still, there was no time for vendettas. The growing season was too short, the memory of hunger too sharp. Festivals, long abandoned during the freeze, returned hesitantly. May Day came not with reckless joy, but with solemn dancing. Songs sung with lowered voices, green branches raised not just to welcome life, but to mourn its loss. Even joy was quieter. And yet, beneath that quiet, something resilient stirred. Children chased hares through grass, slick with dew. Old men mended carts with stories on their lips. Women planted with rhythm and humming, voices low and steady. Life had not been extinguished. It had only been tempered. The fire had not gone out. It had been banked. This quiet return was the miracle of the medieval world. Not the towers of kings, not the chronicles of monks, but this slow, aching return to ordinary life. Because it was ordinary life that was most fragile and most worth fighting for. When chroniclers later wrote of great famines or harsh winters, they recorded numbers. Villages lost, bushels spoiled, graves dug. But what they missed were these moments. The first barefoot step in warm mud, the reappearance of bees, the murmur of frogs near a pond that had been iced just weeks before. These were the victories that peasants claimed. Not wars, not crowns, but survival. And year after year, they did it again. Because they had to. Because no lord or saint was coming to save them. Because the land, brutal and beautiful, demanded their resilience. And because in the end, despite everything, the dark, the cold, the silence, they believed stubbornly that life was worth the wait. Even after the longest night, even after the deepest frost, even after winter had taken everything, something remained. And in that something, they began again